fact, I hope not tempting fate, it's going to be the cover of the Working Group 1 contribution to the 5th assessment report. I say tempting fate because the summary for policymakers of that report is going to be approved by governments meeting here in Stockholm from Monday to Thursday next week. So the report will be launched actually on Friday. So the title that I was given was What Can Businesses Expect? And I have to say, I hope you don't expect me to tell you that because everything is under embargo until next Friday. Having said that, and also talking to Richard Klein, who's going to be talking afterwards, one of the things we felt that was useful probably, in fact for many audiences, not just businesses, is to actually get a feel for what's different about Ipcc. Why should you listen to Ipcc rather than the other brand? What is it that Ipcc does that makes it unique? And essentially what Ipcc does, it doesn't do its own research, it doesn't do its own science, it stands as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Intergovernmental is really important. And the Intergovernmental Panel, over the last 25 years, has now had, just coming into its 5th assessment cycle, with an assessment of scientific literature on climate change issues on the whole range of the climate change program, if you like, or problem. Almost the mantra of Ipcc is it's going to produce reports that are policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. They're intended by the governments of the world to feed into the policy process. If the policy process chooses not to do anything with those answers, that's also the government's issue, but they've got a different hat on at that point. They have to be scientifically and technically robust. They have to be balanced. Comprehensive and balance is, two of our things. They must present uncertainties. They can't just say, well, this is what's happening, and, well, there's some other stuff, but we don't worry about it. They really have to look at the whole picture. So the Ipcc has this structure. It has parent organizations, which are WMO and UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. The Ipcc plenary, which you see at the top, is effectively the governments of the world. 195 governments are members of Ipcc. They can come to the meetings. I think we currently have 115 coming next week. There is a very small secretariat. The Ipcc Bureau is our expert scientists of high standing in their countries who are elected by the governments to oversee the process of an assessment report. And the current assessment report, as many before it, has effectively 3 main parts. It has 3 working groups, which are Working Group 1, which I represent, which is the physical science basis of climate change. It has Working Group 2, which looks at climate change impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and Working Group 3, which looks at the mitigation of climate change. So you can say that, if you like, Working Group 1 provides the fundamental basis, and Working Groups 2 and 3 hopefully provide some ideas of solutions without actually prescribing solutions, but they present what the solutions might be, whether adaptation or mitigation. There's also, very importantly, this task force on national greenhouse gas inventories, which essentially works very closely with the UNFCCC in helping governments report their emissions, which is an important part of that. But the fundamental basis of Ipcc is the bottom line. It's not all the top stuff. It's actually the people at the bottom. It's the authors, the contributors, the reviewers. It's this massive number of people around the world who really put a lot of time into doing this. So this is, the boring bit. These are the principles governing the Ipcc work. Has many clauses, many things, but the 2 things which I really want to emphasize is that the role of the Ipcc is assessing on a comprehensive, objective, open and transparent basis the scientific, technical and socio-economic information that's relevant to understanding the basis of the risk of human-induced climate change, its options, its impacts and options for adaptation and mitigation, but that they are neutral with respect to policy. So the 3 working groups, as I say, I've run through that very quickly. Basically, in this current cycle, which actually started in 2008 with the election of the Bureau, 2009 really the start of the work of the scientists. Working Group 1 is assessing this physical science basis, and we will be releasing our report in 7 days' time. Working Group 2, which looks at vulnerability, impacts and adaptation, has until March 2014. One of the reasons for that gap, if you like, is so that the fundamental climate modelling results which are assessed in Working Group 1 can be taken forward into Working Groups 2 and 3 so that they can base their assessments on the most up-to-date climate modelling. Working Group 3 comes out very quickly after Working Group 2 in April 2014. And then there is a synthesis report which brings together contributions from all three of these working groups. And that will be released in just over a year from now, in October 2014, actually coincidentally in Copenhagen. These are, in a flash, the IPCC Working Group 1 reports to date, just to show you that we have a history started in 1990, went through, the most recent one was the special report that we did with Working Group 2 on extreme events. The elements of the Working Group 1 assessment report, besides this very fancy cover, is a large amount of information. There are 14 chapters, there are annexes, there's supplementary information. In those 14 chapters, we actually look at the, we start off by the observations. What can we observe, whether it's in the atmosphere, the ocean, terrestrial systems, in terms of what are we observing now? Has temperature changed? Has the water cycle changed? And so on. We then go into, from those observations, can we detect a change? And can we attribute that change to human influence? And following on from that, we then have, through the climate modelling, the projections. And we do near-term projections, we do long-term projections, we do regional and global projections. And this time around, we actually have a relatively innovative feature, which I think is going to be very useful, which is to have an atlas of the regional and global observations and projections, so that people can actually take that atlas and look for their region, their business markets, the places they want to export to, what's the likelihood of climate change for their supply chains and everything else. That's an enormous amount of work. So then there is a technical summary, which brings that down to a smaller basis, and then we have the summary for policymakers, which is exactly what we're going to be looking at next week with the governments, which is about 30 pages at the moment, and has 9 figures. And that will be approved by the governments line by line. So they literally go through it, absolutely, and that literally, when you first hear that, you think they don't really mean that, surely. But they actually do mean that. They take line by line. Introduction, this is a report. They can take a while discussing, well, can we call it a report? Do we want to call it an assessment? But and so it goes on. And it's actually a very strong process, because what happens is that the everything that's in that summary for policymakers has to be consistent with the underlying very large assessment. So you'll read in the press, you hear people say, oh, the governments have come to Stockholm to change the summary for policymakers. In a way they have. They've come to Stockholm to improve it. They want it to be something which actually you can understand. It's not techie jargon like I would write if I was, left to my own devices. It's something that they can take and say, that actually means a certain thing. And our citizens can understand that. Our businesses can understand that. So the intention is to improve it, to slim it down, to make it more focused, but only to the extent that the authors, who will also be present, we have about 50 authors with us here in Stockholm. At some point, the co-chair, in going through this discussion, will say, authors, can you go that far? Can you go any further? And they will say, this far and no further. And usually the governments say, okay, then that's as far as it goes, because they understand too. It has to be based on the assessment underneath it. So this is just a sort of schematic of the IPCC process, for want of a better word, where I've tried to show 3 lines, which is on the left-hand side, the scientific community, in the middle, the author team, and on the right-hand side, the government. So the governments are involved right through the process, both in electing the Bureau, in approving the outline of the report, in nominating experts, in selecting experts, and then in doing their review. Okay. And so this is where we're going to be. The approval of the summary for policymakers will come along. But the other important thing are these steps of expert review that come on the left-hand side, and also government review. So this is a well-reviewed report. And here are very quickly the characteristics, most of which I've mentioned. The authors are nominated by governments based on their expertise, gender, regional balance, the multiple rounds of review, and then the line-by-line approval. I'm not really going to talk about treatment of uncertainty. I just want to flag that all of you as business people have to take decisions with under uncertainty. So it's quite important for IPCC to know, to actually describe the uncertainties in their process, how you determine it, how you display it, how you formulate it, and how you communicate it. And that's something that IPCC has worked on quite hard in the last few years to try and improve that aspect. We also have another aspect which is important, of the use of literature. Assessing all of the literature. For Working Group 1, we give priority, if you like, to published journals of peer-reviewed literature, but it's perfectly acceptable for other material to be used, whether it's government reports or even industry reports, as long as the quality of that literature can be assured. And it gives then a responsibility to the author teams to actually ensure that quality. So just to almost finish with some facts about our contribution, we have 209 lead authors, 50 review editors from 39 countries. Not just them writing the report, there are 600 authors, contributing authors, who've brought in their expertise to write small parts. We have more than 2 million gigabytes of data, which have been assessed which are in the climate models, which are then go into the assessment. In the report itself, over 9,200 scientific publications are cited, more than 3/4 of which are new since 2007, which is the last assessment cycle. So this is an up-to-date report. It went through a very large review process, many expert reviewers from many countries plus governments. We had 54,677 review comments, essentially all of which have to be addressed in one way or another. And it will be approved in September 2013. So with that, this is our website. You can, if you look at that, follow it, you will see the summary for policymakers hopefully well before this time next Friday.